Today, we're diving into a seismic shift in global politics. It's all centered on a really high-stakes, kinda unexpected meeting up in the icy expanse of Alaska. And honestly, what happens there could change the world as we know it.
Okay, let's just get right into it. A few days ago, the U.S. president dropped this bombshell statement, swapping of territories. I mean, that one phrase alone sent shockwaves from Kyiv all the way to Brussels and, well, everywhere else. So what on earth does this mean for the war in Ukraine? And what does it say about America's role in the world? Let's break down what's really going on.
So how did we even get here? I mean, this summit in Alaska, it wasn't just pulled out of a hat. No, this is the final move in a shockingly fast and, frankly, radical change in foreign policy that started pretty much the minute the new administration took office in 2025.
And when you look at the timeline, the speed is just staggering. Seriously, look at this. February 12th, you've got a friendly call with Putin and a stunning pro-Russia vote at the UN. Just a couple of weeks later, a huge public fight with Ukraine's president. Then, bam, days after that, all military aid to Ukraine is cut off. This wasn't a series of mistakes. This was a very methodical march straight to this meeting in Alaska.
Which, of course, brings us to the big question, why? Right? Why would the U.S. just suddenly alienate its allies to get cozy with a country it's seen as an adversary for decades? Well, when you start digging into the policy documents, you find a really simple, really powerful answer. This whole new grand strategy, it isn't really about Russia at all. It's about China. And right here, this is the pivot that changes everything. You know, for decades, the old thinking was clear. Russia is the main bad guy. The new doctrine? It just throws that whole playbook in the trash. It says China is the real long-term challenge to the U.S. And in this new great power game, Russia suddenly transforms from the #1 opponent into a potential strategic piece on the chessboard, a counterweight the U.S. desperately wants to pull away from China.
The logic behind this whole thing really boils down to avoiding what policymakers call dual containment. The thinking is pretty simple. Trying to fight a Cold War with both Russia and China at the same time is a total recipe for disaster. It would just drain America's resources, its power, everything. So the #1 goal is to avoid that trap, no matter what it takes. And look, this isn't just us speculating. A policy brief from back in April spells it out, plain as day. The goal is, and I'm quoting here, to attract Russia to the U.S. and to decouple it from China. So to break up that partnership, America feels like it has to offer Moscow something big. And the war in Ukraine? Well, from this perspective, that's seen as the perfect leverage point to make it happen.
But a radical new strategy like this always comes with a price. And that price is being paid by America's traditional allies, especially over in Europe. They've suddenly found themselves on the outside looking in.
This image really says it all, doesn't it? As Washington starts warming up to Moscow, a deep chill is setting in with its European partners. They feel like they've been completely sidelined, deliberately cut out of decisions that, threaten the security of their entire continent. And these snubs have been pretty blatant, and they just keep escalating. First, European leaders got shut out of any talks. Then it got worse. U.S. officials actually said publicly that Europe should have no say in any peace deal. Then, on top of all that, new trade tariffs. And the final blow? The White House declaring that Ukraine joining NATO was no longer a realistic outcome. This has basically left European nations scrambling to figure out how to help Kyiv all by themselves. And all of this pressure, all of it, ultimately lands on one country, Ukraine. With its allies totally divided and its main line of U.S. aid completely cut off, Kyiv is caught in this impossible squeeze play between Washington and Moscow. And the absolute centerpiece of Washington's pressure campaign came down to this one staggering number, $500 billion. This wasn't just some random figure. It was the price tag on a deal that would give the U.S. long-term rights to Ukraine's massive rare earth mineral resources. The administration was basically turning all past aid into a debt, and this was how Ukraine was supposed to pay it all back. And the terms of this deal were, wow, just breathtaking. Ukraine would have to transfer half of all its natural resource revenues into a special fund, a fund that would be 100% owned by the U.S., mind you. And they'd have to keep doing it until that $500 billion number was hit.
So what did Ukraine get in return? No security guarantees, no firm promises, just a vague idea of reinvestment, and only if it was profitable for the U.S. This wasn't a tough negotiation. It was an ultimatum.
President Zelensky's response was crystal clear. He flat out rejected any deal that was made without Ukraine at the table, or that meant giving up their land or their sovereignty. He basically said Ukrainians will not gift their land to the occupier, and any decision made without Ukraine is, quote, dead on arrival. And that rejection kicked off a diplomatic firestorm. The U.S. president launched these blistering public attacks, calling Zelenskyy a dictator without elections, which you'll notice sounds a lot like Russian talking points, and even suggested that Ukraine was to blame for the war. That was the hostile environment that led to that big clash in the Oval Office.
So you put all this together, and what does it actually mean? Because this pivot, it isn't just about Ukraine or Europe. It's a fundamental challenge to the entire international system that's been in place more or less since World War II. And it raises these huge, huge questions about what comes next. In fact, that same policy brief warns that what we're seeing is a return to the 19th century. Think about that. A world where, and I'm quoting, might justifies actions, where alliances are just temporary, and where rules and norms don't really matter. A world run by raw power, not by principles.
And this brings up a massive long-term risk that the experts call moral hazard. So what's that? Well, the danger is that if you reward an invasion with territory, no matter how practical or pragmatic it seems in the moment, you send a global signal that says, hey, aggression works. It pays off. And you risk encouraging other countries to try the exact same thing. Ultimately, the stakes here are just immense. Rewarding aggression could crack the very foundation of the UN Charter. It could embolden other powers who want to rewrite maps. And it could force smaller nations to realize that international law might not be enough to protect them anymore. The deal being talked about in Alaska, it isn't just about Ukraine. It's about the rules that have held the world together for nearly a century. And so we're left with this question. The U.S. is making a huge bet that it can reshape the globe through sheer transactional power politics. But is it actually wise to abandon old, reliable allies for maybe friends, for former adversaries? In a world where might makes right, what are the limits? Where does it stop?